So my favorite part was being able to be in Moscow, walking around the city, talking to the locals, experiencing the message that the Russian government is sending to its own people.
It was a mind-blowing experience seeing how what we say and do here, how it's received over there.
Important as congressional staff that we get to go and experience the locations and places and foreign policies that we spend all day, every day, talking about and debating.
Having a different perspective really helps you shape a better idea of what American foreign policy is and should be. Don't hesitate, just do it.
Okay, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break. We are going to show you another video before we begin panel number 3 and our final panel of the day. And this video is particularly important in any discussion of trend lines because you certainly can't talk about the future of the planet or many of the issues we discuss without focusing on the Arctic, which is a very special focus of the Wilson Center, and we view ourselves as being ahead of the curve, and the gentleman you're going to hear from is a big part of that. So please turn your attention to the screen where you'll hear from Mike Sprague, Director of the Global Risk and Resilience Program and the Wilson Center's Polar Institute.
Hi, my name is Mike Sprague. I'm the Director of the Polar Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it's a wonderful opportunity to share with you the 3 things that I think we need to be watching in 2020 in regard to the Arctic region specifically. The first is the continued changing of this landscape. Due to climate change, this landscape is going through dramatic changes. We know that our oceans are warming globally, but in the Arctic, the landscape there is warming more than twice as fast as anywhere else. This has resulted in the retreat of the Arctic sea ice, almost 2/3 less in the summer extent than in 1979. This means that the Arctic Ocean is darker than it was in 1979, which means the sun's rays are absorbed far more in the Arctic Ocean than they were before, which means the ocean is warming even quicker, which means this landscape is warming even quicker, which leads to a decrease in sea ice. This is called a positive feedback loop. This is not positive. It's actually negative for the global environment, certainly for the Arctic. So we're keeping our eyes on this ever-changing, rapidly changing environment. We have a decrease in permafrost. We have a degradation of coastal areas. We have threatened communities in the United States, Arctic, and Alaska, where over 3 dozen communities are in need of being relocated in the next 5 to 10 years. And we're seeing our ocean's temperatures having an impact on the marine life in the Arctic. So this change that is happening is palpable throughout the world, but certainly most palpable in the Arctic. This leads me to the second area that we need to focus on, and that is this new security imperative for the United States. Because we have a new ocean opening, a 4th coastline the United States must protect and defend. If you think about the Arctic Ocean, think about a new ocean. Along with the Pacific Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic, the United States now has a 4th coastline along the state of Alaska. This has many implications for homeland security, our national defense, and so on. So we need to take a look at how we defend and protect our homeland in the far north. This has implications for the United States Coast Guard in particular, because they are at the tip of the spear in terms of search and rescue, community support, and the eyes and ears of this nation. So to think about our homeland security, it should be thought about in terms of an Arctic region versus the other 3 coastlines. And I would then like to talk about our 4th, which is the great power competition that has emerged in the last decade or so. The Arctic is no longer immune to outside influences. Whereas 5 or 10 years ago, the Arctic was seen as a zone of peace, and it still is, but it was seen as an Arctic bubble, something that had Arctic exceptionalism attached to it. You did not hear about Ukraine or Syria or Crimea in discussions related to the Arctic, but you hear about them now. And so this bubble of security and peace in the Arctic is beginning to be pressured by external forces. For instance, we've taken great note of Russia's expansion of their economic zone along the Northern Sea Route. the immense buildup of their infrastructure along the Northern Sea Route related to oil and gas development. A lot of that funding has come from China. Nearly 40% of the Amal Peninsula's development comes from China. Oil and gas is now transported globally, not just domestic markets, but globally from Russia. They've also developed a significant network of military bases along the Northern Sea Route, some renovated from the Soviet era, but some new. So we see a rise in Russia's interest in the North. In fact, 20% of their GDP and as much as 30% of their exports come from the Arctic, with the help of Chinese investment. Because of Western sanctions, they've had to look elsewhere. They've looked to China, and China has been a very willing partner. This is played out in a number of ways. One, the United States sees the Arctic as an add-on to its national defense. We've always had a presence there, but we have a heightened interest now in what Russia is doing and China is doing in the North. We should be cognizant of what they are doing. Not everything is nefarious, but we should be cognizant of this. But it's a challenging thing for the United States to be thinking about a new ocean, and let me tell you why. I see Russia, China, and the U.S. perhaps in the following way. China sees the world through a lens, and that lens is the game Go, a long-term strategic view of what they would like to see in their nation's best interest globally, while the Arctic is part of their global vision. Their Silk Road strategy extends to a polar Silk Road. So China plays the game Go, very methodical, and they have a lot of years to meet their goals. In Russia, in my opinion, they play the game Survivor. They have one or two big resources, oil and gas. So they have a declining population, and President Putin has made it very clear that the Arctic is part of the Russian DNA, and it is vital to their economic security. So they play the game Survivor, trying very desperately to get their goods to market, mostly resource goods to market, to keep their economy going. And finally, the United States. We play the game Twister. We are a global power. We have to have a presence everywhere. But as we think about the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, the Baltics, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, we also have to think about the Arctic. And that's a challenge for us. So the great power competition, although not at a level one should be ultimately concerned about tomorrow or next year, it's something we need to think about. But for the U.S., it's a challenge to us. And in all three of these areas, homeland security, great power competition, and in climate, the United States, we think, in the next year, will be looking for a strategy that's far more integrated throughout the U.S. government. It simply calls for something like that. Climate is the big driver, looking at the homeland and our efforts in the Arctic and having a much bigger presence there. But also, we'll look at the ways in which the United States tries to balance its global power and take into consideration a brand new oceaning opening up before us. Thank you.
I can't get visuals of the game Twister out of my head, so but I'll try to overcome that. No, I like those game metaphors. That was fun that Mike came up with. One of the things Mike's presentation illustrates is the cross-regional nature and the connecting of dots that are part of the world of Wilson. None of this stuff lives in isolation, and we pride ourselves in being able to make those connections in ways that are meaningful to you, members of Congress, and others who need this kind of information. So welcome back for our final panel, and if you're watching via the webcast, again, thank you for joining us, and if you want a copy of this publication that everybody in the room was able to pick up outside the door, you can log on to wilsoncenter.org and find a copy and even download a PDF version. And if you're tweeting about today's event, either in the room or from a remote location, please use the hashtag #OnTheHorizon2020, and that's another way to get our attention if you'd like to tweet us a question. So, same format. I'm going to introduce our panel to you. Each will have about 5 or 6 minutes to make their opening observations. And then we'll have a bit of discussion up here before we turn it over to you for questions. And when we wrap, there will be a reception across the hall. So, and a little incentive to those of you who have hung in there with us for the entire day. So from your left to right, Robert Daley is the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Jean Lee is director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. And Abraham Denmark is director of the Asia Program. And Robert, you are first. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to participate in this On the Horizon discussion with you. The Kissinger Institute focused on 3 issues looking ahead at China, but if they'd asked us for 15, we would have come up with 15 almost as quickly. The 3 we look at are U.S.-China rivalry beyond the trade war, friction on China's periphery, and the emerging technology and soft power competition between the United States and China. So a few thoughts on each of those briefly. The U.S.-China rivalry has taken shape relatively quickly since, but not because, Donald Trump became president, and we are still debating the basic strategy, our basic disposition toward China. And the debate was engaged yesterday by Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska, in remarks that I'll come back to in just a minute. I see the debate as taking place now between 2 camps. There are those who want to manage a relationship which is recognized as being contentious or rivalrous for the long term. They want to manage it as well as possible in what is basically a play for time, recognizing that China is still changing. Then, as opposing the managed camp, there are those who want to win the competition. And for people in this group, the belief is that we're out of time. We squandered time through engagement. It was a sucker's game, and we are now involved in something approaching a Cold War. Again, yesterday, Ben Sasse of Nebraska published a nonpartisan, a very thoughtful, long think piece in The Atlantic called "The Responsibility to Counter China's Ambitions Falls to us." To us or to the U.S.? To us. It's always a problem. And he, I think, falls into the camp of we need to win this competition. Let me read you, I think, the most important paragraph from Senator Sasse's essay. China intends to reestablish its place, not as one political power among others, but as the world's preeminent power. We are witnessing the return of the Middle Kingdom. While the Middle East remains a hotbed of violence and instability that threatens American lives and interests, we cannot allow our primary focus to move from the unique, long-term, I agree with all of that, and then we get this, and existential threat that is Beijing. This is the defining national security challenge of our age. This claim that Beijing represents not only a challenge or a threat, but an existential threat, is gaining increased currency in Washington. I understand the reasons for it. Senator Sasse and many others who agree with his policy prescriptions have a lot of valid insights about the nature of the China challenge. But existential threat, to me, doesn't give due credit to the very worrisome term threat, which we've always had. Must every threat be existential? A threat means it requires all of the resources, intellectual resources, the policy resources of the United States to minimize. An existential threat means pass the ammo and reload. We need to make a distinction there. We hear that it's an existential threat too from Steve Bannon and the Committee for the Present Danger China. We hear versions of it from Senator Cotton of Arkansas, who has called China the evil empire. These are all Republican examples, but actually there are voices on the Democratic side too. This is a bipartisan view. And we see it in last week in the statements from Senators Rubio and Scott of Florida celebrating the withdrawal of the U.S. Peace Corps from China. The Peace Corps has brought 1,300 volunteers to China over the years, many who have become leading sinologists, writers about China, who've helped us to understand the country. And Senators Rubio and Scott, in their statements, said that this was in America's interest because China is no longer a developing country, and because these 1,300 volunteers, most of whom are English language teachers, are helping young Chinese to increase their ability to read and write and function in English. They are also training up, the argument goes, future leaders of Huawei and other Chinese tech companies. That's the explicit argument. So against this background, do we want to manage relations with China as well as possible or win a competition? My big question for 2020 is, does this view that it's an existential threat become broadly socialized over the coming year? To date, this is a bipartisan Washington view that has not yet taken root in American businesses, in American universities, and in American communities. If we are to see this as a competition that must be won, we also have to ask ourselves what policies that may indicate for the United States. We can come back to this in Q&A if you like. The second issue is friction on China's periphery, which has been in the news a lot recently. China, the camp that would say we must win, that we must beat China in this competition, tends to put China forward as an unstoppable monolith that moves inexorably toward a world that is ever more safe for the Chinese Communist Party. And there's reason to think that this is what Xi Jinping would like to do. But China faces many domestic constraints: an aging population, debt, corruption, pollution, rich-poor disparity, all of which could put the brakes on China's development. And China, more importantly, is constrained internationally. Not only, and Abe may go into this, does it have 14 nations on its land borders, 4 of which are nuclear, 1 of which is North Korea. It also has a very daunting maritime periphery. But we've seen over the past year that China is having a hard time exercising its governance, getting the policy results the Communist Party would like, even on the periphery that is either Chinese or is controlled by China. The Chinese Communist Party has had 22 years to make the case to Hong Kong that it's in its interest to be part of the PRC. No sale. It's had 70 years to make the case to Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Again, no sale, demonstrating that Chinese power is limited even where it is most capable of exercising that power. So perhaps our threat assessments are slightly exaggerated. The question for 2020, 2 immediate questions. 1, do we pass the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which has been passed by both the House and Senate, but has not yet been reconciled, has not gone to the president? This would further exacerbate tensions with Beijing. And then I've mentioned Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang. There's another shoe ready that will drop sometime in the next few years, and that is Tibet. When does that happen? And the next shoe that drops is going to be the death of the Dalai Lama, who no longer leaves Dharamsala and is well into his 80s. When that happens, all of the tensions that we see in Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong will come to a head and will be greatly exacerbated as Dharamsala and Tibet seek to put forward Tibetan cultural imperatives about identifying the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, and Beijing insists that it, and only it, has the right to decide who the Dalai Lama is. You will see when this happens a very strange, very heated debate about which is the true Tibetan Buddhist incarnation. This debate will be conducted between Chinese communists who don't believe in Tibetan Buddhist reincarnation and American, mostly evangelical Christian politicians who also don't believe in Tibetan Buddhist reincarnations, but they were going to be at each other's throats. So look out for that. And then last, the tech and power competition, which in the interest of time, I'll just go to the question and skip the analysis, which we can get back to. The question that the U.S. faces as we put technology and innovation at the center of U.S.-China competition is, can the United States continue to have the world's leading innovation system if we cut ourselves off from the world's biggest market and its greatest source of financing and talent? That's where the rubber hits the road on these policies. Can the United States be both innovative and open? What degree of trade-offs do we find acceptable given our need for continued innovation and our security fears that come from China's rise? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Jean, you're up.
So on Korea, thankfully, we did not have a Christmas gift from North Korea at the end of last year, and I wasn't expecting one, to be honest. We are in a period of uncertainty right now because it is still unclear. Will North Korea go back to provocation? Will it test its nuclear weapons or its ballistic missiles? These are violations of UN Security Council resolutions, of course. And I do think that we may see some provocations ahead as Kim Jong-un seeks to put some pressure on President Trump to come back to nuclear negotiation, or to improve his position when they get back to that nuclear negotiation. It's unclear at this point. The North Koreans have, so let's just put this into context, remember that we had this historic meeting in Singapore in 2018, in June of 2018, where President Trump sat down and met with Kim Jong-un, first sitting U.S. president to do so, gave Kim Jong-un an enormous amount of legitimacy. They came up with a very sparse agreement. There was an agreement on the part of Kim Jong-un to place a moratorium on long-range ballistic missile testing and nuclear weapons testing. But they didn't say anything about short-range missiles. So we've seen in that interim, as those talks have fallen apart and reached a standstill, North Korea trying to improve its hand with short-range missile launches. We may see a little bit of that. I think what we were watching for in the end of 2019 was really to see how impatient Kim Jong-un would be. Is he going to return to provocations and another nuclear test? And I should remind you that at this point in the development of their program, any test that they conduct is going to be enormously dangerous. Or does he have faith in his relationship with with Donald Trump? Does he believe in that personal relationship? And is he going to hold out to see what happens with a presidential election? I think he actually, despite the threats that we saw in the end of 2019, I think he has invested so much in that relationship with Donald Trump that he still wants to see if he can make it work. But doesn't mean he's not going to provoke in the meantime to pressure President Trump to come to his side of those negotiations. So we're waiting to see what happens. We're still in a bit of a holding pattern. Now, there are a couple milestone anniversaries that we're watching this year. The 70th anniversary of the Korean War, the outbreak of the Korean War, takes place in June. And it's interesting hearing you talk about U.S.-China, because this is also about U.S.-China. I mean, the Korean War is partly about that. It is a Cold War conflict that has persisted to this day and that North Korea has used strategically to its advantage. I do think that Kim Jong-un was hoping and wanted some sort of a deal to mark that anniversary as a victory. Not sure he's going to get that deal that he wants. The North Koreans will be looking a little further ahead to the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party. So we will see a big military parade in Pyongyang around that time. Now, in the context of the sort of stall in U.S.-North Korean nuclear negotiations, one thing we need to watch for is that this is putting a strain on the alliance between the United States and South Korea. South Korea is getting anxious. They have so far stuck with the United States, stood by the United States, but getting very anxious to engage North Korea and to have some sort of a role in what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. And the more language we see that they are pushing for an exemption to sanctions, the more we're going to see a strain on the traditional relationship between the United States and South Korea. It's already complicated right now. The United States and South Korea, and Abe can perhaps speak about this in more detail, they're in negotiations on how much South Korea should pay to host U.S. troops. That is a difficult negotiation that continues. That is placing a strain on that traditional relationship. The other issue that we are looking at the Korea Center is also related to U.S.-China, and that's South Koreans are very interested in trying to figure out how they fit into that competition, that strategic competition. So how do they fit into Indo-Pacific strategy? So quite a lot of our discussions in South Korea have been about perhaps, I could say, advising South Korea on how to see themselves in the larger Asian context. Trying to carve out a path for themselves where they remain allied with the United States, but can also perhaps broaden their interests in the region so that they don't feel like they have to choose between the United States and China. So I think for me, that's for Korea, those are the main issues that we're watching in 2020. We'll see what happens in the coming months. I do think we'll see some provocation on the part of North Korea to try to influence those nuclear negotiations. Hopefully it won't be a major provocation. A lot of it will depend on whether Kim Jong-un feels the need to provoke President Trump to get him to pay attention and to get back on his radar. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Abe, you're up.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for coming, for sticking with us through a long day. It's been absolutely fascinating for me, and I'm glad that you're all here. As was mentioned before, I direct the Asia program. We cover everything between Afghanistan and Japan. So as you can imagine, finding the top 10 issues for 2020 was difficult, let alone the top 3. But what we identified was uncertainties in economics, the threat of war in South Asia, and alliances in crisis. And I'll talk a bit about the first two, try to spend most of my time on the third. In terms of uncertainties in economics, what we're expecting to see is continued division among countries that normally identify with one another in terms of economic growth and regional economic architecture, specifically tensions between Japan and Korea, as well as tensions within ASEAN, within the Southeast Asian countries, which are developing increasingly antagonistic or at least turbulent political relationships, which is fueling different theories about growth, different theories about economic architecture, which means that in addition to what you all have read about U.S.-China trade tensions, about various trade deals that are being negotiated, there's also this intra-regional economic tension that we expect is going to flare up in this coming year, which will have significant implications for the United States and our regional strategy. Second point I wanted to make, the second crisis, the second theme we wanted to highlight was the threat of war in South Asia. The Wilson Center Asia program has one of the most long-standing programs on South Asia, the terrific Michael Kugelman running our work on South Asia. And what we saw last year was a sudden and unexpected flare-up of tension between India and Pakistan, with India conducting the first airstrikes inside Pakistan since 1971. We also saw India revoke the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir. We saw other instances of India passing laws inside India that threatened regional issues, as well as Pakistan beginning to make some slow, minimal progress in terms of addressing some domestic security issues. Obviously a long ways to go, but still making some progress. But we're expecting continued tension, the possibility of continued tension between these two nuclear powers, with the overhang of uncertainty about the future of Afghanistan, touching all of what's happening between India and Pakistan, with the United States and the Taliban reportedly going through negotiations, potential for intra-Afghan negotiations as well between the Taliban and other Afghan groups, including the sitting government, suggesting that the next year is going to be very important in terms of what happens not only in India and Pakistan, but in Afghanistan as well. And lastly, we talked about alliances in crisis. Jean talked about the host nation support negotiations going on between the United States and South Korea, negotiating how much South Korea will pay the United States to offset some of the costs of our alliance. The Trump administration requesting a several-fold increase of that, which the South Koreans are very much opposed to. Also, at the same time, Japan beginning to negotiate their host nation support agreement with the United States, with reports that the Trump administration also expecting a very large increase to those numbers as well. And one of the things we try to do in the Wilson Center Asia program is to explain how this is looking, how geopolitics are looking, not only from the perspective of Americans looking at Asia, but also from our Asian friends as well. So Robert mentioned different views inside the United States on U.S.-China competition. And this is an issue that affects our allies, our partners, other countries in Asia directly. Most of them have strong political, economic, and at times security ties with the United States. They have traditionally relied on American dominance to preserve a liberal international order, the operating system that has allowed stability and prosperity to flourish in Asia, while at the same time, they have been increasingly engaged with the Chinese, trying to reap economic benefits from the rising China, also trying to keep the Chinese relatively happy with them so that they don't incur Beijing's wrath. So you get to the point now where if you go into Asia, most Asian countries, and you sit down and ask them point blank, if the United States and China go to war, whose side are you going to be on? Most of the time you'll hear both. We'll be on the U.S. side and on the Chinese side. They even countries that are allied to the United States, Japan, South Korea, are engaging more and more. They're trying to engage the Chinese out of concern primarily about uncertainty about the sustainability and reliability of American power. And I want to give a bit of background on this, which also informs some of the groups that look inside the United States looking at China. Now, I'm a senior fellow in the Kissinger Institute as well. We talk a lot about Kissinger. We talk a lot about American strategy. And there's a fundamental aspect of American strategy towards Asia that I wanted to highlight for you. Kissinger wrote about it. I'm going to quote Kissinger to you in a couple of minutes. It's not mandatory that we do it, but I like to do it sometimes. But really, it goes back to the theorist Mackinder, going even further back to the roots of American strategy, the open door policy, even back to the 18th century. So this is from Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, written in the 1990s, a fantastic book, where I think he describes the history of American strategy very well in 2 sentences. Geopolitically, I'm quoting now, geopolitically, America is an island off the shores of the large landmass of Eurasia, whose resources and population far exceed those of the United States. The domination by a single power of either of Eurasia's 2 principal spheres, Europe or Asia, remains a good definition of strategic danger for America, Cold War or no Cold War. It's pretty good, right? And I think that's what's driving some American concerns about China, but also concerns from our allies and partners in Asia, used to this dominance from the United States, and recognizing that China has emerged as a peer competitor for the United States and trying to understand how they're going to navigate these complexities. And so what we're expecting to happen is for these countries to look at all elements of national power, political, economic, and security, and start to pick and choose how they're going to align between the United States and China. Whereas they might find the Chinese 5G system more attractive, whereas they might see the American security system more attractive, and try to engage in what we're starting to think of as functional spheres of influence, rather than just geopolitical spheres of influence. And so, as we're thinking about this competition, if you agree with the Mackinder-Kissinger view, as China continues to grow, if the United States is going to try to compete in terms of size, U.S. allies and partners are going to become increasingly important in terms of economic power, political power, and even military power. And so as we watch these negotiations over host nation support with Japan and Korea, as we see Xi Jinping engaging with Japanese Prime Minister Abe, potentially even likely visiting South Korea for the first time in about 6 years, probably later this year, keep this broader geopolitical context in mind. Because as the United States and as the Chinese engage with these allies and partners, engage with these third parties in Asia, what's really happening is a new front, a new dimension to the broader geopolitical competition between the United States and China. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Abe. We've been asking all of our panels to take what has come to be known as the Dalai Challenge, because Robert Dalai suggested that we should identify the most positive trend line that we can within the countries or regions or topics that we're looking at. And so you are the challenger, now you are challenged.
Well, my overall assessment of where U.S.-China relations are headed over the next few years is pretty bleak, and that's, I think, a consensus view.
We did say positive.
But there's a couple potential bright spots. My concern has been that we will not make an informed decision between whether we want to manage competition with China or win the competition. My concern is that this will be driven by crisis. And so let me give you 4 bad kinds of crisis, and then the good one, which is the positive, just very quickly.
This is cheating.
Well, otherwise you won't know what I mean by a good crisis. So there's the Sputnik crisis. That's sort of a good crisis in that it gets America to compete. That's one way this could be driven. There's the Suez type of crisis, which makes us suddenly irrevocably aware of America's weakness and the degrees in which we've become ineffectual. There's a Tiananmen crisis, which socializes and really nails down the bad China narrative. And China provides a lot of fodder for that, it must be admitted. Then there's the 9/11 crisis, which I think we're quite prone to as well, which is the distraction crisis that takes us off the ball. Do we go down another sort of rabbit hole or get into a very complex set of commitments in, say, the Middle East such that we don't pay attention to what's going on in China? But there's a new kind of crisis, and that's connected to the coronavirus that we see spreading. There can also be a crisis that helps remind us of our common humanity and the need to work together to do things like prevent pandemics, to share information, to share technologies. One of the reasons that Chinese government has been relatively effective this time, I know it's debated, but I actually was in China all through the SARS crisis. I watched this very closely. It was the American Centers for Disease Control post-SARS that helped train China in how to respond to these crises domestically and internationally. And China has in part been following that playbook. They've been using American technologies that are helping them to get the genetic sequencing of these viruses much more rapidly, and therefore you can identify them much more quickly. So there's an upside to China's rise that I think we forget, and this is part of the positive story. Last November 14th, the American FDA for the first time gave accelerated approval, approved a Chinese-developed cancer drug for use here in the United States. We approved capsules for mantle cell lymphoma, which is a kind of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And this drug, which is effective, comes out of China, developed in laboratories that are staffed by Chinese who are mostly educated in the United States and are in collaboration with American and global scientists. Those positive stories are still legion. They're out there. And they're not getting told. And we're talking about curing Americans and people in other countries with cancer. And so, yes, there's silver linings if we look for them.
So you need a pep talk. This is the guy to go to. Actually, you pulled that out of the fire. It ended up in a very positive place.
Yeah, well, you asked for it.
Gene.
So I'm going to move away from geopolitics and say that this is the year, or it's been a year, where South Korea has come into its own in terms of its soft power. And I don't know if any of you have heard of BTS. I'm a little too old to really enjoy BTS.
We could play some now.
11-year-old daughter.
But a South Korean film has been nominated for the Academy Awards, first time ever. And it may seem like a small thing, but this is the year that South Korea will perhaps be able to come out of the shadow of North Korea. For so many years, we've only thought of South Korea in relation to North Korea. But South Korea it's a chance for them to step into their own and recognize that they have their own power to play a role in terms of soft power diplomacy. We've talked about this a bit. And so it's really, South Korea, we have to recognize the tremendous strides that country has made, perhaps even in contrast to the different direction that North Korea has made in the 70 years since the Korean War. But I think that we will be watching, many Koreans and ethnic Koreans will be watching the Academy Awards. I think it's in a couple weeks, right?
Yes.
To see if they win that first. It may seem like a small thing, but it's an enormous thing in terms of South Korea's identity and its feeling that it can stand on its own. So I will say that's a positive thing on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you. Abe.
I have 2 little kids, so that makes me an optimist. So I have 2 points of optimism to highlight, and I'll go through them quickly. The first is what I see in Asia as the continued strength of democracy across the region. Last year we saw in India the largest democratic election in human history, and it went off pretty well, considering the scale. And already this year we saw an election in Taiwan, in which, despite tremendous efforts at political interference from Beijing, Taiwan was able to have a presidential election as well as their legislature have an election very successfully. So across the region, in India, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, we see democracy continuing to hold. So as we look at deepening competition between China and the United States, we have a tremendous advantage in terms of the legitimacy of democratic systems across the region. The second point that I'd like to make is an observation I've made going to conference after conference in Asia. And it reminds me of a story from the Cold War, from the NATO experience that we had, in which there was a meeting of the defense ministers at NATO, and they all started complaining with one another about the Americans. I think the American Secretary of Defense was late to the meeting. And they were saying all the things that you hear Europeans say about Americans, right? No sense of history, quick to make a decision, brusque, all the things that you hear. And after about 20 minutes, the British defense minister said, yes, that's all well and good, but unfortunately, they're the only Americans we've got. And I've noticed the same trend in Asia when I'm in conferences in Australia, Japan, Korea, India. I'll spend days hearing about all the problems of the United States, that we're easily distracted, that our politics is very divisive, that we can't focus on a strategy the way the Chinese can, all the things that you hear in these discussions. And then at the end of every conference, there's the panel of, so what do we need to do? We need to get the Americans back in. We need to do this with the Americans. We need the Americans to do that. Because for all these countries who are looking at a rising and increasingly assertive China, we're the only Americans they've got. And they still have that faith that at some point the Americans will be there and will be the kind of America that they need to see.
Don't forget us. We're the only America you have. It's a bumper sticker. I think it's terrific. Thank you. Before we go to your questions, and we're going to do that in a moment, Gene, I have a follow-up I need to ask you. You said something really interesting about Kim's patience, or I think you said his impatience. Impatient or patient toward what endgame? And what's the timeline for that?
So the question of patience, I think, applies to both President Trump and Kim Jong-un. I think that will Kim Jong-un be patient enough to resist that provocation, that next test, or will he feel that he needs to test in order to get back on President Trump's radar? And I think he's trying to figure that out. I think we have to remember that he's trying to balance pressure from China and Russia. Not only pressure from China and Russia, but also trying to play China and Russia. But I think that's the question of patience. Is he patient enough to wait it out, or is he going to feel like, actually, I'm being ignored here? The North Koreans know that the best way to get attention is to behave badly.
But toward the end game of lifting sanctions, of what is the...
To some sort of a deal. I do think that he believes that he's got a relationship with President Trump, and he wants to get back to that negotiating table. I will be honest, I do think that watching his body language at Hanoi, he panicked. I mean, I think he was very taken aback that President Trump walked away so quickly. He expected that negotiation to go on a bit longer. I think he miscalculated. Kim Jong-un was too tough. He actually was a little bit too tough. He didn't understand that President Trump just didn't have the patience for it. And so he miscalculated, looked very panicked. And so he's been trying to figure out how to get to that situation again, but with the guarantee that he'll have a deal.
Okay, great. Thank you. Remember the rules of the game. Please wait till you have a microphone in your hand. Introduce yourself, and please be brief and direct your question. Right here, this woman. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Katie Wang with NTD TV. My question for Mr. Dalai is about this coronavirus that's developed very quickly in China. And so just wondering, what do you think about the potential economic and political impact it may have on China? Can you give more analysis about that?
Well, we've already seen it have impacts on stock markets in China and Asia and around the world. What we know from the SARS experience, past isn't always prelude, is that this is going to continue to develop, to strengthen, that we will see more infections, possibly thousands more in China and around the world, and more deaths. The news over the past week has been mostly bad. We have learned that people can have the virus for up to 2 weeks without being symptomatic, and that they may be infectious during that period, which makes this extremely difficult to track. We're seeing more. I think we have 5 cases now in the United States. There will be ever more of those. But then coronaviruses once the weather warms up, they go to ground. They can't survive in warmer temperatures. We may then be facing another round, and this will be something that markets will be responding to of this in the fall, because a typical coronavirus pattern, SARS was an exception to this, is that they continue to mutate during the off-season when it warms up, and they can come roaring back with a vengeance, even in an even more virulent form in the fall. Again, SARS didn't do that, but certainly markets will be looking for this. There will be probably a fairly sudden break when it warms up, but then it could be coming back again. So we're in unknown territory in terms of where these pandemics go. When I was working on SARS in China in 2003, I was working at the time for Johns Hopkins University, which has some of the best epidemiologists in the world, who were convinced at the time that there would be a major, disease X global pandemic within 5 years, which didn't happen. But the methodological grounds for that prediction still hold. And so what you see now is a lot of response, from the markets and from institutions, not so much to the number of cases that we know about, but to the potential for the growth. It's a response to the unknown. So you'll see two waves, this spring and then again in the fall, I think, of market worry.
Oh, could you have a microphone if you got a follow-up, so we can all hear it? No, take the microphone, please. We need to hear it. Thanks.
Okay. What about the political side? What do you think about people's confidence about the government handling this?
We'll have to see how it develops going forward. There has certainly been a fair amount of criticism that the Wuhan municipal government and the Hubei provincial government did not respond quickly enough initially. And there has been on WeChat a lot of indications that people are just distrustful of government statistics. They think that they're hiding the real scope of the infection, and they are reading Centers for Disease Control and other foreign epidemiologists' estimates that based on what we do know of the disease, that there should actually be already 10 times more infections. They read all this stuff. So it's a political hit to date in that we can see the Chinese people don't quite trust the information that comes from the government. Li Keqiang, the premier, has now been put forward as the front lines guy in hazmat suits to go to Hubei to try to congratulate people in the medical establishments, but also to tell people that the government has this. Li Keqiang, not Xi Jinping, because he doesn't want the blame for this if it goes badly. But if they manage to contain it relatively well, and that could be the case, well, then all glory to Xi Jinping, right, compared to what happened in 2003. So this could go either way.
Thanks. Yes, in the back of the room, there are three questions. We'll take all three of them.
Hi, my name is Hyun Kim at Voice of America. I want to ask a question to Lee in Denmark. In terms of denuclearization of North Korea, including South Korea and American as well, waited many times, so much time to waiting for denuclearized North Korea. But what do you think about how much feasible of the UN sanction and negotiation so far? And plus, if North Korea should be denuclearized passively by global society or some others, what should be the red line to stop North Korean nuclearization, to stop them? Because as per said, the United States is monitoring their process of nuclearization. So what should be the red line to stop North Korean production?
Gene or Abe, I'm looking at you.
Go ahead.
Want to flip a coin?
I don't think that in 2020, since we're focused on 2020, people expect significant progress towards denuclearization. We've been in this negotiation since the 1990s, it's the early 1990s, to no success. In terms of red lines about what North Korea could build, the challenge is that it's always reactive, is that the United States would be reacting to what has already happened. So if we caught a red line, if we establish a red line, the North Koreans cross it, then you're dealing with a North Korea that has that capability, whatever that may be. I think the red line that the United States, the only real red line the United States established with North Korea has been don't attack our allies, don't develop nuclear weapons. And they've violated both of those several times. So looking ahead at the next year, since that's the focus of this meeting, in addition to what Gene said before, there's also a political calendar. And to me, the question is, I think it's fairly clear that President Trump would like this issue to remain calm and quiet for the election. At least that's my sense of it. And that, to me, suggests that Kim Jong-un has an opportunity to build leverage, to make things turbulent for him, unless Trump cuts a deal with them. So the question, I think Gene put it very well, is Kim Jong-un going to take that opportunity to build leverage and cause trouble, or is he going to keep things quiet and wait things out and see what happens? And I think that's an open question.
Thanks. We have about 3 minutes left, and we have two questions, so let's see if we can get to both of them.
Ken Slater, I'm just with myself. A couple of quick. First, this is sort of peripheral question. If vis-a-vis China, is there one country in Southeast Asia, not India, that you could name that you think is most important for the U.S. to keep a strong alliance with vis-a-vis China? and for Ms. Lee is comment on the rift between South Korea and Japan.
Well, maybe I'd say Indonesia if we had to pick just one, although I would prefer not to have to focus on one, but probably Indonesia. I don't know, Abe?
My initial list with no preparation, first would be the Philippines, since that is a treaty U.S. ally, and recently Duterte suggested that the alliance may go away because somebody wasn't getting a visa. After that, I'd also put Singapore and Indonesia as well as being very important relationships for the United States.
Thanks. Sir, you have the final question of the day.
Thank you. Paul Cadario from the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. The framing of the big question of the day, sustainability and reliability of American power, is certainly, I think, a beautiful way to encapsulate it. I'd like to ask Mr. Dalai, who presented a very bleak view of U.S.-China relations, how your assessment would vary if you were to distinguish between America and Donald Trump's America and China and Xi Jinping's China? And would you be more positive with a sharper distinction there?
Well, you're asking me to distinguish between the actual and the hypothetical. So hypothetically,
November is coming.
Right. So I think that the question really is, do the United States and China have persistent, long-term, unchanging interests which set them at odds with each other regardless of who is the leader, would be the way that I would frame that. And I think that we do have some interests which are divergent and which lead us toward more contentious relationships. We have fundamentally different visions of what a sustainable, constructive peace, especially in the Western Pacific, would look like. I think it is true that China seeks a Sino-centric Indo-Pacific, and we seek its opposite. But that doesn't mean that we're bound for a Cold War. I think there's a lot of room to manage that relationship better. One of the things that worries me about the group which is pushing for prevailing in a Cold War is that they focus on what China would like to achieve in its ideal set of circumstances, and they want to gear up against that. But the question in foreign relations is never what is the other country's ideal set of circumstances. The question is always, what will they settle for? That's the question for us as well. What will we settle for given that we have competing interests and that we cooperate? And this is where there is room for diplomacy and alliances to have an impact on Chinese behavior and choices. So we can't demonize China just because we think that in its ideal state of affairs, it's the number one nation on earth. Well, of course that's true. The question is, what will they settle for? And part of that will be determined by our behavior and our choices and our diplomacy. And that's where I think we should focus.
That's, I run into these people in the hallway or the lunchroom, and I feel smarter. And having a chance to sit with them today as they're really focused and on top of their game has been a real privilege. Thank you for joining us as well. I want to hand the microphone to close things out over to the boss. Jane Harmon's coming back up. Before I do that, Jane, I just want to give a special thanks to Casey Breitenbeck and Linda Roth, who helped pull together today's event. Thank you to my colleagues. Jane, you get to close things out.
Okay, so raise your hand if you learned something this afternoon. Raise your hand if you learned nothing this afternoon. That would be pathetic, wouldn't it? I call the Wilson Center an intellectual candy store. And that means that you can survey the goodies, eat as much as you want, and the only place you get fat is in your head. And that's a good deal for me as far as I'm concerned. But seriously, we have a collection of geniuses here. Many of them were on full display this afternoon. And I don't think there's any other place you can get, certainly not on any cable news station today, yesterday, or for the rest of the week, a menu like this where you can think deeply about the issues in each region, in each country that we should be concerned about and how they relate to each other. And I also want to commend the audience for asking very good questions. I mean, we only let smart people in here, so if you made it in, you're smart. And the questions are smart. I mean, nobody was grandstanding. Nobody asked a question that everybody could already answer. And Many people ask questions that I didn't know the answer to, and listening to our geniuses, I learned a lot about what the answer is. One last comment. We not only go deep by region, we go deep across regions. And I mentioned that at the front end. We have 5,000 former scholars here. That's a large number in our almost 51 years of existence. I asked, well, how many are dead? And the answer is 250 or so out of 5,000. So if you're a scholar at the Wilson Center, you live a long time. This is the lesson. Because your brain grows, and that's a good thing, and it feeds your soul and your body, and you live a long time. And it is really true that there are so many people in the world, they're not all physically here anymore, who know so much about the ground truth in their regions, and we call on them all the time. We're going to do an even better job, because not only do we now finally have a good list of who they are, and they are organized and categorized, but we're more actively in touch, and one of my goals is to make the Wilson Quarterly, is to have the Wilson Quarterly, which is, again, our cutting-edge, award-winning quarterly, have articles by these people on a more regular basis, because we really should hear from them more, and have our list of books at Wilson include their publications as well as the ones that are grown here. So it's a big candy store. And I think everybody's restless and wants, I'm standing between you and the reception. That's a bad thing. But I just finally want to conclude with how proud I am to lead this place, and how much of a difference, how much value it adds at a pretty bleak time, I would argue. This is not taking sides, but at a bleak time in our public discourse. It's not bleak inside this building. So thank you for coming. Stay connected.